There are a lot of liberal theories in international relations, but no classical liberal theory, or not enough classical liberal theory. Free trade sells everything. You know, that's a bit of the idea that went on, but it's not enough. You should also think about power in international relations, about war, the balance of power, the role of rules and legislation, stuff like that.
Hello, and welcome to this broadcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Steve Davies, the Head of Education at the IEA, and today I'm delighted to have with me Dr. Edwin van der Haar, and we're going to discuss his just published book, Human Nature and World Affairs, An Introduction to Classical Liberalism and International Relations Theory. Now, Edwin, classical liberalism and international relations are two things that are often not really put together. So could you start by telling me really, why did you write this book? What was your motive or reason for writing it?
Well, there are a few motives, actually. Thanks, Steve, by the way. First of all, indeed, as you say, not many people know that classical liberals from the early stages onwards, say from the Scottish Enlightenment onwards, have thought and have written about international politics and world affairs. But this is mostly ignored. It's a bit scattered in their writings as well. So one really has to dug it up and put it into context and take one theory out of it. So that's, I think, important, because they do have different things to say than is commonly understood as liberalism in international relations. There are a lot of liberal theories in international relations, but no classical liberal theory, or not enough classical liberal theory. So that was one reason, and that's so in that way I hope that people who are interested in this field get acquainted with how a classical liberal views world politics, and that would be interesting for students, I hope, but also for academics and people who are self-identify as classical liberals, because often they don't have sufficient idea as well. Put it a bit simple, free trade sells everything. You know, that's a bit of the idea that went on, but it's not enough. You should also think about power in international relations, about war, the balance of power, the role of rules and legislation, stuff like that. And there is ample evidence and ample ground in classical liberal theory to discuss also international issues.
So, in other words, this is first of all an effort of recovery of a kind of submerged or obscured intellectual tradition, and secondly, it's providing the interested parties of the kind you mentioned with what you might call the intellectual toolkit to understand, if they are classical liberals themselves, more about what a classical liberal approach to this very topical issue is.
Yeah, exactly, and do so in a consistent way. Because you often see that just people, pick a little bit of Smith, do a little bit of Hayek, mix it all together, leave out all the things you don't like, and then go, say and present it as something completely logical, which it is not, in my view. You have to take it from the basics, so from the individual towards groups, and then onwards to the international system.
So, in other words, this is, in a way, methodological individualism. You're saying that you start off with the foundation of the acting human being, then the human being in society acting with others, and then above that, what level? So, what is the key intermediary for you in this story? I mean, because it seems to me, reading it, that the individualist analysis that you start off with at the beginning and the human nature that's there, when you get to the international level, it's no longer actually individual human beings who are interacting. So what are the actors in international relations, and how should we understand them as classical liberals?
Yeah, the main actor in international relations is a state, or the nation state. I mean, these are fuzzy concepts, a lot of literature on it. I will just leave it there. But the individual has a very emotional attachment to the state. That's the basic insight, for example, of Hume and Smith, but also Hayek and Mises. And from there, you go on to the international level, as you say. So the state is the main actor on behalf of the individual.
Right.
That's the way it should be seen. It's also difficult because the state, I mean, classical liberals obviously don't trust the state with all the to do the right thing for all the liberty. So there's a tension there, but it's a bit inevitable in a way, because individuals are not capable, of course, to determine what goes on the international field. Although international relations is a very human activity. So that's why your view on human nature is also important for that, because, for example, liberals are often seen as peace-loving people who think the eternal peace is possible, whereas classical liberals look at people as they are. They have a realistic view of human nature, and they think, well, violence, conflict is also part of human nature, and if it's part of human nature on a domestic level, inevitably it will also be part of human nature at the international level, which means you can't eradicate conflict and violence at the international level, which is why the human nature part is in the title. But it's also important because the other liberal theories in IR are often associated with exactly that eternal peace idea. And classical liberalism does not buy that.
So you're distinguishing your view very clearly from what you might call the dominant liberal vision, which is the vision of Wilsonian institutionalism, going back before then Immanuel Kant and the idea of cosmopolitan peace, perhaps. So you're saying that this is a more realistic and grounded vision of international relations, basically. Given that, how do you distinguish your view from classical realism of the kind that, say, John Mearsheimer is very well known for pushing?
Yeah, I mean that of course indeed is the other side. How you should see that is that realism are very. They don't care about individual liberty. They care about reasons of state, and that's a big difference, because it also means that realism values international organization, international law, as long as it serves their purposes. Whereas for classical liberals, it's something fundamental. For example, the principle of sovereignty, which goes together with nation states, is something for all states. The sovereignty of all states should be respected. Whereas realists, they basically don't care too much. They believe in great power management, and if the sovereignty of a small state should be suffers in the process, well, too bad.
Yes.
So there are a fundamental difference there, but they do share the feeling that the nation state the state is the central actor in the international politics. They do share the value or a positive valuation of the balance of power, although for different reasons perhaps. And they do feel that the world is a state-based system, as I just said. So there are commonalities, but the differences are there as well. Yeah.
No, so to put what you say slightly in a classical allusion, Thucydides in the Melian dialogue has the Athenians say to the Melians, "For as you well know, justice is something that only applies between equals, and in this world the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must." And from what I understand, you say that is basically the realist view, and you're saying that actually classical liberals reject that because they essentially say that the principles of justice and human rights should apply to all states, even small ones like the island.
Yeah, although they acknowledge that the world is no paradise.
Well, yeah.
And they don't aim at a paradise as well. So, but they do feel if once you have rules in place, you should keep to them. The Pacta Sunt Servanda principle, you should keep to them. Whereas realism thinks, well, whatever the power consideration of a particular state leads us to, fair enough. That's
it's might is right versus justice. Basically.
Exactly, it's Russia versus Ukraine.
Yeah. So in that case, you clearly think that for a classical liberal, international agreements, international law matter and are important. That states can make agreements with each other and that they should abide by those agreements. How far though should this go? Because you seem to be sceptical in the book about much of
Yeah.
the recent tendency in this direction.
Well, the thing is that sure, you need international rules, and you can't have spontaneous ordering all along. You need extra rules for that. Just as in the domestic situation, you need rules. However, we know that state power can also be the biggest threat to individual liberty. And that also goes in the international situation where international law and international organization are very hard to change, right? And international law trumps national law. So if something illiberal is agreed upon at the international level, it really has severe consequences for individual liberty. So that's why you need a limited state also at the international level. Sure, you need some rules, sure, you need some organizations, but not too many. And the past decades have seen explosions of international law and legislation, treaties, and also quite a number of international organizations who either new ones were established or old ones widened their scope tremendously, far beyond their original meaning and remit.
And so what view does that lead to in your mind with regard to the question of humanitarian intervention, which certainly since 2001 has been a major feature of a lot of mainstream liberal international IR thinking?
Yeah. True, no. I think classical liberals are very hesitant because they, first of all, the principle of sovereignty, but of course a ruler could lay back behind this sovereignty, say, we're a sovereign nation, you should not interfere, which as a principle is fine, but of course it could be abused. There could be genocide behind the national border. I think classical liberals do view, in that kind of emergency cases, there's an argument to intervene. But for many of the other instances we've seen in the past decades, it didn't work, didn't lead anywhere, cost a lot of, and the classical liberals also point out that the costs to the intervening country are huge, in lives lost, in taxpayers' money. Those are things that should be taken into consideration when looking at humanitarian intervention. So you should be very, very careful before you do something like that.
So in a way, it's a bit like a just war theory, which means that for it to be justified, it has to jump through a whole series of hoops, which are actually very demanding, so that it's only a very extreme kind of case that will justify it.
Well, there's discussion about how demanding they actually are, but for example, Adam Smith, at the end of the theory of moral sentiment, he was like almost emotional about his positive views of Grotius, which of course is often seen as, incorrectly perhaps as the father of international law, but at least he was one of the persons who was able to write down a comprehensive system of international law with the just war principles, and the just war principles are quite an extensive list, really. Yes. So, it's not that restrictive. That could be one of the criticisms of just war. On the other hand, at least you have a set of conditions before you can actually go to war, and once you are in war, there's a set of rules you should abide to, especially like protecting citizens who are not combating parties, stuff like that. So there's a very strong direct connection between classical liberalism and the just war theory. Yeah.
So to bring this up to the immediate present, which is obviously rather fraught with the war in Ukraine and the emerging multipolar world, many would say, with the rise of China and growing geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. What contribution do you think this rediscovered theory that you've set out in the book can make to policy in this conjuncture? What do you think a policy former in Foggy Bottom or the Foreign Office or the Quai d'Orsay can take from your book?
Well, I think what they can perhaps let me start in a different way. Now, what they can do with this book is see what emphasis they put in their work. So, for example, if I'm Dutch, or from Dutch experience, there's a lot of effort in our international and foreign policy on international law, and expanding international organizations, while perhaps, although we're part of NATO, the international security arrangements, the alliances are taken less seriously. And I mean, for example, in the contribution, most of the NATO states don't contribute as much as they promise themselves, right?
Yes.
Which I think is a very clear example of how not to pursue your foreign policy, right? Security is most important, which is the Russia and Ukraine war is once again making clear. Nobody expected to have an interstate war in Europe, and still here we are. So security is number one, and that means you can, the emphasis of in your foreign policy can shift a bit with the help of this theory. I would recommend at least to foreign policy experts.
Yes. So in other words, don't forget the security question is never going to go away, you would say.
Indeed. I mean, you have a lot of liberals of all kinds of persuasion who had a bit like a starry-eyed ideas and dreams about, an international world society where we will all be living peacefully, where the nation state should not have as much influence as it does, where the military would be less important, where all rules-based global system, and that's a fantasy. And I think, especially for classical liberals, there's a role to play there to say, look, we're not like them. We're more realistic, so to say, in terms of what actually goes on in the world and what are the capabilities of people, and that we can use to have a more grown-up, I would say, vision of international relations as classical liberals, but also as a critique on other liberals.
So, in other words, to summarise your argument really, essentially what they should take from it is that we should avoid, on the one hand, the naive fantasies that have tended to dominate a lot of policy, but at the same time also steer away from the utter cynicism, if you like, of the hard-nosed realists, and to try to combine realism with commitment to principle, which is a good principle generally. I
agree. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I try to express in the book. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.